En este contexto de construcciones transdisciplinarias, para todos los que han estado vinculados a actividades de SARAS, en particular los cursos, hay una serie de autores y de artículos que son para muchos de ustedes conocidos, como este artículo de 2020 de Norström y un conjunto de autores, en el mismo sentido este otro artículo sobre arquetipos de coproducción en el ámbito de la sostenibilidad de Josefine Chambers y también una gran cantidad de autores, o el análisis de arquetipos en términos de eh, pathways o formas de impulsar transformaciones. Justamente en ese contexto es que se inscribe este seminario, y precisamente vamos a comenzar con los aportes de Norström y de Chambers. En el caso de Norström, tuvimos un pequeño percance de agenda, así que vamos a compartir con ustedes la grabación que nos envió Albert en la tarde de ayer, y como van a ver a continuación, aparece indicado desde el principio su correo electrónico para que justamente todas aquellas inquietudes, preguntas o dudas se puedan dirigir directamente a él. Van a ver todas las instrucciones en la grabación que vamos a compartir. Y 10 y 15 interviene justamente Josefine Chambers, eh, eh, que vamos a seguir un formato, digamos, habitual, con una pequeña intervención, pequeña no, una intervención de 40, 45 minutos y 30 minutos para el intercambio, ¿no?
Hey everyone, hope everyone's doing well. I am so sorry that I can't be with you live today. This is something I recorded yesterday, well, actually today for me. Hopefully it's still going to be useful for you. And as I mentioned to Nestor, you're more than welcome to send me emails if you have any questions concerning my presentation. I'm going to keep this relatively short. I know that my slot is around 45 minutes, but I'm actually sitting now in a time window between meetings. So I need to wrap this up within 30-35 minutes. So yeah, it's going to be exciting. And like I said, I hope it does trigger some thinking among yourself. My name is Albert Norström. I'm an associate professor at the Stockholm Resilience Center. I'm also currently now the science director of Earth Commission. But what I'll be talking to you now is sort of a synthesis of the outcomes of a paper that I wrote together with many colleagues, I think it was 2-3 years ago, on the principles for knowledge co-production in sustainability research. And that paper came out of a series of long discussions and experiences that myself and all my other colleagues had when we were working in this field of knowledge co-production, sensing a bit of frustration that it was a term being used by many big entities, but without a clear definition and without a clear set of usable principles that can allow you to kind of guide your efforts towards good, high quality knowledge co-production. So, I mean, the context behind this is actually we talk of it, or we talked of it in the lead up to the paper as, the decade when knowledge co-production became mainstream. And I think that still rings true. The past 15 years have seen a growing number of initiatives. For example, here, the German, the Swiss sustainable development strategies, all using knowledge co-production as a defining element of the direction they want to take. Big research networks like the National Global Change Research Plan and the 2025 vision of research networks like Future Earth, again, all using knowledge co-production as a key element in these new plans. So, it's becoming a buzzword. It's still being used very frequently, I think, by research entities, by research practice entities, and even by national governments and international governmental bodies. as a key thing, a key ingredient in the new directions forward. But I still think there's a problem that it's often very poorly defined, and there's still, a sense of vagueness around it. What is it really, and what are the defining elements of knowledge co-production? I think one thing to really be clear about as we enter this series of lectures now, you'll be hearing from myself and Josie afterwards, is that knowledge co-production isn't actually something new. One could see it as, being a very broad family tree that encompasses different streams of thinking that have popped up at different times throughout research. Very simplistically, I would say that knowledge co-production includes aspects and elements of things like transdisciplinary research, which again is something that can be defined in many different ways. It includes elements of post-normal science or mode 2 science or participatory action research. So it has, a long history of different terms and different things. One can see it as loosely linked and evolving cluster of approaches that includes all of those things that we mentioned. And I think these cluster approaches have become increasingly prominent during the past 40 years. And as I will show in a few slides coming up, I think these forms of knowledge production are actually an answer or a response to the increasing complexity and social relevance of emerging challenges, such as environmental concerns or economic development, social upheaval, and things like that. Yeah, there's been a huge, body of really good reviews that I think do a much better job than I've just done to synthesize these different family of co-production approaches. Karina Wyborn and colleagues published something 5 years ago in annual review of the environment and resources that maps out different concepts, describes them, and then builds a sort of a nice family tree, if you will, of these different concepts and how they are all kind of can be seen as different flavors of co-production. To make it simple, I would say I'm often very pragmatic. I try to simplify things. All of these approaches share a few ingredients. They're context-driven, right? They're problem-focused, and importantly, they require the engagement of multiple disciplines. And as I go a bit further, when I start talking about knowledge co-production, I would even say that not only do they require the engagement of multiple disciplines, they require the engagement of multiple ways of knowledge, different knowledge types. But they emerged as a response to this increase in complexity and social relevance of all these different challenges that we see now in the Anthropocene. And I'll speak a bit about the Anthropocene soon. Right, a lot of us working like Earth system science, knowledge co-production, sustainability science, we often are very clear in marking out that the epoch or the times we live in today are markedly different to the post-industrial era, the times before 1950. In essence, one can really think of us having entered, or us as humanity on this planet have entered a new geological epoch or Earth system dynamic epoch, which we term the Anthropocene, which in essence means that human activities are the dominant driver of change on the planet through our actions and activities and consumption patterns and economic models of growth. There's a few key characteristics of the Anthropocene in the sense that change and things are happening at a faster rate. So things are accelerating in the Anthropocene. This can be, shown in many different ways. I often use these graphs to show what I mean by acceleration. This is a mapping of what we talk about as the Great Acceleration. It's a systematic mapping of different Earth system trends and different socioeconomic trends. On the Earth system side, we have indicators like the levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, the levels of nitrous oxide and methane in the atmosphere, the levels of stratospheric ozone loss, the increase in surface temperature on the planet, the levels of ocean acidification, and so on and so on. On the socioeconomic trend side, you have indicators such as population growth, real GDP growth, urban population growth, primary energy use, etc., etc. This is something that came out of major global research change programs such as the IGBP, the Bayer Institute, the Stockholm Resilience Center. But when they began mapping out these trends, what they found was that somewhere around 1950, you have the advent of a great acceleration. So changes in these Earth system trends and socioeconomic trends accelerated really quickly around 1950. So we talk about this as the great acceleration. The Anthropocene is also very turbulent. And one example I use to show what I mean by this turbulence is this global map of regime shifts, which has been carried out by researchers at the Stockholm Resilience Center, Juan Carlo Rocha. Some of you might know him. He's been active with Sarat. He's worked with Nestor in many different ways. What this research group did was map out the occurrence of big systemic changes in ecosystems around the world, which we call regime shifts. They can be the shift of a coral reef to a macroalgae dominated reef. They can be the shift of a forest ecosystem to a savanna ecosystem. They can be the shift of a mangrove into a non-mangrove state. So a bunch of different big catastrophic sudden shifts in ecosystems. And what they find when they put all this data together was that the incidence of these regime shifts is increasing and that it's happening all over the world. So this is what we mean by turbulence. Things are changing in many different ways. And one example is this increased occurrence of regime shifts. Researchers have now mapped this up on the global scale, making the indication that you not only have regime shifts on a local scale, like in ecosystems, you can have these big Earth system climate-driven, climate-linked tipping points that could be triggered as global temperatures increase. The Anthropocene is accelerating, it's turbulent, it's also hyper-connected in the sense that what we do in one place of the world has consequences somewhere else. You have global trade that's linking different places in ways that they weren't linked before. This is an example that I use to illustrate this. I went to my local supermarket 3-4 years ago to buy some fish, which I thought would be fish caught off the coast in Sweden. Instead, I found in the fishmonger market, in the freeze disc, this parrotfish, which is a coral reef tropical species, which definitely doesn't live outside in the Baltic. So again, fish caught somewhere very far away, being shipped all over the world for consumers like myself to consume and buy. Yeah, so this is sort of the basis of it. We live in the Anthropocene, an era which is turbulent, it's hyper-connected, it's rapidly changing, it's accelerating. You have a lot of crises and shocks increasing. Some of you may have heard, that we're coming into an era of the Anthropocene, which is characterized by polycrises, the sense of many different crises happening at the same time together and being interlinked, like biodiversity crisis and a pandemic crisis. And so in this context, there is a lot of uncertainty around what knowledge we need to make sense of the world. There's a lot of dynamic complexity. There's also a lot of possible different conflicts across values and interests in this very quickly changing world we live in. So we probably need new ways of generating knowledge. And to be very simplistic, one could draw a caricature of the way knowledge was generated before the Anthropocene, so like 40, 50 years ago. The very kind of standard way of generating knowledge is the science push mode of knowledge generation, where scientists set the agenda for what type of science is produced and disseminated. And then, you saw a shift in that, I would say, like starting about 40 years ago to a very kind of another mode of knowledge generation, which was very much driven by the demand, the pull, the priorities in the generation of new knowledge, basically being set by those making decisions or the industry or the governments. So entities outside the scientific community. Again, sticking to caricatures, what I would say we need today is something that bridges these things. So one where scientists and users work together to generate knowledge. And there's been a lot of research done on why that is important. I won't go into that exactly here, but in a simple manner, why the argument stands that it's a much stronger way of generating knowledge if you actually have a more equal say in how knowledge is produced between academics and non-academics or users, is that it increases inclusivity and thus the enrichment of the picture. You get a richer picture of the problem you're trying to solve. It also leads to higher accountability and legitimacy. So democratic issues are more likely to be resolved if you have a more interactive manner of generating knowledge. But it can also lead to a higher level of impact and usability if you bring in end users or key stakeholders or interest holders or right holders into the process. So these are sort of the fundaments that we came into this process of trying to write a big synthesis paper as to what knowledge co-production for sustainability research is and what its key principles was. The huge demand for knowledge co-production, the epoch we're living in, the Anthropocene, which sort of requires us to think more seriously about knowledge co-production, and also the kind of underlying research coming beforehand showing that if you actually involve end users, you get a much better picture, a more legitimate picture, and so on. So, very simply around the method behind this, what we did is we brought together some of the biggest experts in the field. We weren't one of them. We were just a small team, myself, Chris Vitanovic, Marie Lööf, Simon West, and Karina Wyborn, all having worked in knowledge co-production, but all of us being quite young, early career researchers back in the days, even though it was published in 2020. I think this began in 2017. So this was like 7 years ago. I was a bit younger, maybe not that early career, but still more early career than I am now. And we were interested in these questions. So what we did was get together some of the really big names in the field of sustainability research and basically create a survey where we're asking them what are their thinkings of the definitions of knowledge co-production, what they find are the key principles of knowledge co-production. And we did a bit of a coding around this. And that's how the main results of the paper came out. And we then asked them to be co-authors on the paper as well. So a really nice way of, generating a research paper from an iterative kind of survey style approach. The definition we landed after, surveying all these experts was that knowledge co-production, in essence, is an iterative and collaborative process involving diverse types of expertise, knowledge, and actors in order to produce context-specific knowledge and pathways towards a sustainable future. And the 4 principles that were extracted or identified as the key building blocks of good quality knowledge co-production, if you're doing sustainability research, was that it needs to be context-based, it needs to be pluralistic, it needs to be goal-oriented, and it needs to be interactive. And I'll spend the next 25 minutes or so unpacking those 4 principles for you, and hopefully they're going to make sense. So the first principle is that in order to have high-quality knowledge co-production for sustainability science, you need to have it context-based. So you need to situate the knowledge generation process in a particular context, place, or issue. So basically, you need to understand the history, the background, the dynamics of the place you're carrying research in. It's not rocket science, but this is something that came out as being really important. So in essence, when you're doing knowledge co-production, consider as much of the place and issue-based context as possible. What is the history, the political timelines, the ecological dynamics, geographical dynamics, and socioeconomic conditions of the place you're working in. Also, consider the involved stakeholders. What is their backgrounds, their identity, what are their experiences as you go into the process? So one of the examples we used in the paper to highlight this specific principle was a case study by one of the co-authors, Ingrid van Putten, who's been working in the Torres Strait with very remote and economically disadvantaged communities where literacy levels are low, cultural traditions are strong, and there was a huge fear of being prosecuted for illegal trade. And the project was all about, trying to understand how you come develop sustainable fishing practices in these regions. So being context specific meant actually taking into account these different dynamics and, designing the research project to be very sensitive to these different issues. It also really meant, building on existing work of individuals and organizations within the team. So, it wasn't just about parachuting in, it was about being very careful in utilizing specific kind of key gatekeepers to these communities that could, introduce the research team or could help build trust initially to kind of disperse a lot of these kind of misgivings and possible kind of misunderstandings that could be established. And it was also about, doing things very, very, very carefully with regards to the stakeholders being involved. Situating the process in a particular context, place, or issue is also about really looking below the surface of your system. So looking beyond, just the kind of the shocks and stresses and the different superficial functions and patterns and process happening, but also try and understand what are the mental models and paradigms that your stakeholders or the people living in the area are wedded to or have been using for a long time. Also try and understand what are the systemic structures and root causes of some of the socioeconomic patterns or some of the ecological patterns you're seeing in the region. So it's really it really indicates that it's a time-consuming and reflexive process at the core of it. If one could simplify, I usually use this schematic maybe just to show some of the previous work I've been involved in. I'm a coral reef ecologist back in the days, and a lot of the projects I was involved with in the beginning was around understanding, overfishing and how to do something about that. And if you're not in those cases, if you're not thinking about the context space of a social ecological system, you might, consider that the problem of overfishing is only because of the fishing communities and the type of gear that they use, that they're using dynamite fishing or non-selective gear. But if the fishing practices they're using. But if you start thinking about the context, you start digging into, okay, what is the social dynamics that is causing some of these fishing communities to actually adopt the destructive fishing practices that they're doing? They might not really be wanting to do that, but they might be, poverty traps that they're trying to escape that is actually forcing them to use these different fishing practices. There might also be outside drivers, for example, consumer demand for specific target fish that is, leading to a huge incentive for them to actually go out and utilize destructive fishing practices. So, a lot of those issues pop up when applying this first principle of knowledge co-production. Okay. I'll jump through this because, I'll send the slides and you can look at these in a bit more detail if you want. And I'm sorry, it's been a long time since I held this lecture, and last time it took a very long time, and I'm trying to be sensitive to keeping times. Right. Yeah, so just to summarize, there's a few questions that we put forth in the paper as ways to kind of help a researcher or someone trying to kind of work with knowledge co-production. What could they ask themselves if they're kind of applying this principle in the correct way? So you can actually, ask yourself, what is the workability of a co-produced solution? Can it be implemented by participants in the community that you're working with? Can it help solve the initial problem? Where did the request for knowledge co-production originate from? Did it come from an actor already encountering the problem in the area, and so on? There's a series of steps in that we identify in the paper that can help you kind of get a sense of, am I addressing this specific principle in the correct way? Right. The second principle of high quality knowledge co-production is that it needs to explicitly recognize the multiple ways of knowing and doing. It needs to be a pluralistic process. So you need different types of academics from different disciplines. You also need different non-academics from government, from industries and businesses, but even international organizations, civil society, local indigenous communities. And this makes it a much more complex project to navigate, but it really is crucial if you want to do high quality knowledge co-production. It also requires that you have a range of knowledges and forms of expertise involved in the process, and also various dimensions of diversity. So different types of actors, different types of knowledges, and different other dimensions of diversity, such as gender, ethnicity, and nationality. And there's a huge, amount of literature now that's actually showing that including different types of disciplines, different types of knowledges, and different, gender diversity actually leads to better outcomes, So we're not just making things up. There's a lot of good science behind this to back the case. In fact, there's this fantastic paper by colleagues Maria Tengo, Eduardo Brandizio is involved, all about the process of connecting diverse knowledge systems, such as local knowledge, indigenous knowledge, et cetera, to different scientific and academic knowledge types, and how that actually generates an enriched picture that, leads to a bunch of different really, really good outcomes. And actually interesting, even big intergovernmental assessment bodies are now, jumping on this bandwagon, which is really refreshing to see. IPBES, for example, in their assessment report on pollinators and pollination and food production, actually adopted a sort of a knowledge co-production approach. At least they were, bringing in multiple strands of knowledge, indigenous knowledge and scientific knowledge together to generate this assessment, which then generate a much richer picture and a much stronger understanding between different stakeholder groups in setting the assessment status update. So really cool stuff. Yeah, this is just summarizing what I said. I can just give you a bit of an anecdote from some of the work that we did. So I was working in this participatory approach, or a knowledge co-production process, if you will, in southern Sweden, working together with different municipalities in the southern part of Sweden and different stakeholders in those municipalities, trying to get a sense of the different ecosystem services that these different municipalities and the stakeholders in the municipalities. So we're looking at like 50 different municipalities, a big area of southern Sweden, and getting a sense of, what ecosystem services were important for the landowners, the forest owners, the farmers in the region. And anyway, when we first got into this process, we said, okay, we'll come up with a first analysis and a first sense of these are the key ecosystem services that these stakeholders are concerned about in the region. And we thought, we're experts, we're scientists, we've done this in many different parts of the world, so it shouldn't be a problem. And basically, we presented this list of ecosystem service to them. And in the first workshop we had, they were just like shaking their heads saying, no, this doesn't really make sense. And it was so refreshing, because then we sort of realized, wow, this is, really an opportunity. So we began engaging them in a very long and time-consuming process, which really threw a spanner in the works of us producing these really cool scientific maps and products. But we sat down having a lot of these deliberative discussions and workshops, and in these iterative analysis actually refined the type of ecosystem services and the variables we use to map them out afterwards in a knowledge co-production process. But the take-home message for me here is that because of this really close interactions with the different stakeholders in the region, we got a much, much richer picture of what the key ecosystem services were. We also got a much better idea of what data to use, because they actually knew what kind of data was out there and what was relevant for the type of ecosystem services they were interested in. And so our analysis, even though it took much longer to carry out, became much, much better. This principle really requires careful consideration of what actors to include, because again, you can't bring in everyone. You need to keep it manageable. So there's a lot of different tools that allows you to categorize what actors to bring in. And again, I'll share the slides so you can look at these different papers that link to different typologies or approaches. Mark Reed's published a lot of, how you can choose what stakeholders to involve. In the paper that we wrote, there's also a lot of thinking about stepwise approach to participation. So sometimes, especially in communities, again, going back to the Torres Strait, where there's a lot of gender-based violence, you want to bring in both males and females, of course, into the process, but you want to do this stepwise. So what, Ingrid Van Putten and colleagues did was that they first began engaging female fish folks in the region to build trust and to give them a safe space, and then started bringing in male fishers. Because if you brought them in all together from the beginning, the gender-based violence history would probably put a lid on what the females were actually willing to share in the group. So again, thinking really carefully about how you bring in these different knowledge types and how you stepwise increase participation is really key. You really need to think about power imbalances. Again, we talked about this, and again, there's a really nice, rich literature of what kind of tools you can bring in to think of this. So, sorry, I'm going to zoom in really quickly to the third principle here, which is all about the need to be goal-oriented. You really need to articulate defined, shared, and meaningful goals that are related to the challenge at hand. And you need to do this in a common way. So you need to commonly agree upon what is the goal of your knowledge generation process. Is it you want to have an impact on policies and practices? Do you want to change the way people think in the context? Do you want to generate new relationships between actors or new networks? David Lang, he's published a lot about how you do this in an iterative manner. And this is something we really point out, that actually the goal setting process is not something you just do at the beginning of your knowledge co-production process and then just see, did we reach the goals at the end? It's actually something you want to do constantly in different iterative loops, right? So one really good, piece of advice is keep the goals flexible and build in a process of reflexivity and adaptation. So you can always go back and learn from your goals and adapt them when necessary. So really, this is really coming back to the kind of adaptive management stuff that Buzz Holling wrote in the late 70s, evaluate and learn and adjust your plans as you're doing things. This is a key thing around good knowledge co-production. Yeah, like you see here, I'll let you guys read it. So one way to evaluate whether you're doing it in a good way is, have a focus on the degree to which a co-production process has enabled the generation, revision, achievement of desired goals. Keep it flexible. Try and get a sense of the participant perceptions, whether they feel that project goals have been achieved in the final outputs, etc., etc. And now the final key principle of knowledge co-production, this is linked to the one I spoke about before, is really allow space for learning, active engagement, and frequent interactions. Yeah, this might sound like a very obvious one, but I think it's often the one that's the most problematic because it just takes so much time. So really build in high levels of interaction between actors, between the academics and the non-academics throughout the whole research process. Having said that, I'll jump through this, the one key take-home message there is that you want to engage, but again, you want to do it in a very strategic manner. So again, a very concrete ingredient is make sure you tweak the level of engagement to the actual capacity of your participants and your non-academic stakeholders to be able to engage. I think academics, even though we have busy lives, we actually have a lot of time to engage. It's our job to be at workshops and meetings, whereas non-academic participants in the knowledge co-production process actually have much more limited time to spend in engaging in these processes. So we need to be really sensitive as to how often we invite them. So be really careful in how you plan that engagement, which is super important, but you need to be careful who you engage when and how often. But it's critical because it builds ongoing learning and trust building among participants. And one way to kind of monitor this is just a very pragmatic, because sometimes you're being asked to evaluate across, how well are you doing in knowledge co-production. You can actually just do this quite easily by capturing the nature, the frequency, the quality of interactions between participants. Just keep good meeting minutes, interviews and surveys with people. How often are you meeting? What do they feel is the quality of the meetings? And so on. Yeah, so I'm kind of leaving it at that. I'm not sure. I have a few more slides. I think I have a few more minutes. I have 4 more minutes. I'll try and end with that. This is sort of the definition we set and the key principles of knowledge co-production. Hopefully, I'm really sorry for having rushed through it, but hopefully they've triggered some pragmatic thinking amongst you and some understanding as knowledge co-production. It sounds complex, but with these 4 key building blocks, at least it sets you on a good place to try and understand of how you could possibly start moving towards that yourselves. And that was the whole idea of this paper, for it to be quite pragmatic and operational. The ending of the paper is very much that, we need to understand how knowledge co-production can be tweaked for the context of the Anthropocene. It requires considering all these cross-scale dynamics, the cross-scale acceleration, and so on. And so it really requires understanding, can we work with different groups around the world, like the point we make in this paper that was led by Paddy Balvanera, that tries to understand that you have multiple places around the world doing knowledge co-production in the Anthropocene. We really need to be better in working together as a community, as a network, to learn from one another. What are the different findings of these different knowledge co-production individual projects all around the world? It also requires, and this is my final slide, and this is a bit of a controversial one, but I'll end with it as well. It probably requires doing knowledge co-production with stakeholders that for a long time have been seen as a sort of anathema and sort of the bad guys of global change and the people that have put us into the Anthropocene in the first place. This is an example from an initiative that's being driven out of the Stockholm Resilience Center, where a few academics published, Henrik Österblom, I think some of you know him as well. He's also been very active in SARAS. A few academics 10 years ago mapped out the impact of some of these big fishing companies and their impact on fish stocks all around the world. And what they found was that a handful of these seafood businesses were actually responsible for a lot of the overfishing happening in the seas. And one possible direction they could have taken there was one of name and shame, of just naming and shaming these different seafood businesses and saying, these are the bad guys, we don't want to work with them. But instead, Henrik and colleagues actually said, well, how about we start a knowledge co-production process with them? How about we bring them in and have a dialogue and a long-term collaborative process where we actually try and sit down and together make them understand that they can be a force for good. And so over the past 10 years, a lot of meetings have been happening. And now all of a sudden you have this self-generated process that the businesses themselves are taking responsibility for in order to map out their input and consequences on the businesses. And anyway, now I'm seeing that there's a few other people that have joined the meeting room in which I'm having a Zoom meeting now. So I'll have to stop sharing and I'll have to stop the recording. And like I said, if you have any questions, please send them to me through email. I'm really sorry that this got a bit rushed, but like I said to Nestor before, it's a manic time of the year with a lot of meetings and wrap up things that I just need to get hold of. But hopefully this has been interesting. This has been useful. Yeah, enjoy Josie's lecture afterwards, which I think is going to be a super nice continuation of this.
Ahora sí. Bueno, primero que nada, varios avisos. Comparto para que todos anoten su correo electrónico, ¿tá? No tengan miedo ni inhibición en escribirles. Lo segundo es que obviamente vamos a estar compartiendo la grabación, probablemente incluso colguemos el mismo archivo que nos envió Albert separado, así queda más fácil de seguirlo, y también le vamos a compartir el PDF que acaba de mostrar Albert, justamente para que tengan a mano todas las referencias que incluyó y demás. ¿Alguna consulta o duda mientras esperamos a Josefine? A ver si ya llegó. Todavía no llegó. ¿Hay alguna
Sí,
pregunta?
estoy aquí.
Ah, Josie. Nice to meet you. It's a
Hi, nice to meet you.
to meet you. I wait a second because Josie, where is you? Ah, okay, perfect. Okay, well, Josie is a young research that right now is working in Utrecht University. She is a part of the Young Research Academy of Utrecht University and works mainly in transdisciplinarity. All the people here knows very well your papers, Josie, and in this sense, thank you very much for this opportunity to know more details about your recently research contribution, and go ahead.
Great. Thanks so much for the invitation. Really nice to meet people virtually like this. Let me just share my screen so that I can pull up. Oh, you know what? I think I actually need permission to share my screen. So I just sent a request through. Let's see.
I think that you can share your presentation. Right.
Yes.
Perfect.
Okay, great.
Looks very well.
Yep, everyone can see it full screen?
Yeah, perfect.
Okay, great. Thanks. Yeah, thanks so much for the invitation. I thought it'd be nice to give a little bit of an overview of what I've been doing in the field of co-production, but then also bridge this to especially what I'm working on now, which I would describe more as we often talk about co-production of knowledge or co-production of diverse forms of knowledge and how, for example, scientific knowledge, local knowledge, other practical forms of knowledge, how these can connect. But I have also, I'd say most recently, I've been focused especially on, I would say almost like our knowledge of possible futures, or that really normative knowledge of what we find desirable or what we might imagine could be that is not necessarily knowledge of how the world is now. So I thought I'd also reflect a bit on how I am thinking about co-production of imagination of possible futures to also kind of bridge this work on co-production to what I'm working on now. So there are just three very brief parts to this talk. I do plan to finish earlier than the 45 minutes, so also hopefully we have a bunch of time for discussion and questions. But I thought first I could reflect a bit on what are we actually co-producing, by whom, for whom, and then given that I'm so interested in the shift towards also how can we not only co-produce our understanding of the world now, but also how we might desire it to be different, that I can reflect a bit on what I mean by that. And then I'll try to also connect this to some examples as well. And even if they're not so much in the field of food transformations, at least hopefully they connect from different social and environmental perspectives. So the work that I led on co-production that started back in 2017, that was really a response to the emergence of co-production as a concept, but also a practice. And we just noticed that there were so many different terms and methods and approaches that were being thrown around. I just listed a few here in this black box. And that there was also just a lot of confusion around, well, what does it really mean to co-produce something, given people have so many different definitions and ideas of what that could or should mean. Also, a big motivation for diving into a study of how people are co-producing was that people were increasingly raising concerns over how power and politics were often being ignored in these processes. So even if there was kind of a discourse around attention to power, that sometimes these collaborative processes would risk reinforcing power relations. Also, a critique of a simplistic approach to integration. So assuming that if you just bring different perspectives around the table, or try to bring them together through interdisciplinarity or transdisciplinarity, that somehow this will magically integrate without considering all of the different power dynamics between different forms of knowledge and how people hold different power that's very much embedded also in how people see different perspectives. So the need to be much more nuanced in how we think about the imperative to better integrate. And then also some people pointing out that we tend to put a golden halo around co-creation and co-production and assume that it's always better to have a more collaborative process. But there's also a dark side to this. There are also very negative outcomes that can result, such as breakdown in trust if these collaborative processes are not managed so well. So we shouldn't always, and huge time inputs as well. So we shouldn't always assume that it's necessarily better, which links to this paper that came out around that time with the title "To Co-produce or Not to Co-produce," really reflecting on when is it valuable and what is the added value. So this led in a process that started up in 2017 that brought together ultimately 42 different people who saw themselves between, so as researchers, but also practitioners of co-production, very much kind of pracademics. And we combined all of our 32 different cases where we were trying to co-produce. We were bringing together, in most cases, more than 4 disciplines, more than 3 different types of sectors. And we were trying to understand how we were approaching co-production in different ways and what different methods we were using. And as you can see from the map here, they really ranged in their scale and location as well. So some were very locally based around a particular co-management challenge. Some were broader learning networks. Others were even at the scale of international dialogue. And we were all kind of approaching this question of how do you co-produce and potentially get more than the sum of the parts in a way that meaningfully advances or addresses some sort of social environmental challenge. And this led to so 2 different papers, which is probably also the entry point of why Nestor originally reached out. One of these papers in Nature Sustainability. This paper shared the 6 modes of co-production that we identified from our 32 cases. So it was a really interesting process of trying to understand some of the similarities, but also differences in the way that we were co-producing knowledge. But not only knowledge, it also was very apparent from this study that we were co-producing, in some cases, institutions, new relationships, new values, new power dynamics, all sorts of different types of outcomes. With also some of these modes focusing more on even intending different types of outcomes. And I won't kind of if you have questions specifically about this paper, feel free to ask. I won't spend kind of time in detail going through all of these different modes and parts, but I might just comment on the fact that my PhD research was actually one of these 32 cases. And for me, it was very interesting because I had experienced certain struggles. So mine was it kind of fell out in this mode of reframing power. And I started to kind of, I think because I was a political ecologist, I was taking a political ecology approach in my PhD. I was really kind of within this frame of speak truth to power. So do the critical, examine how interventions are producing, in that case, unintentional negative outcomes for forest conservation, but also people. And then I had this I suppose I realized later, this very kind of simplistic theory of change. If you just produce that critical knowledge and you publish it or you share it, then it will somehow magically have some intended impact along those lines. In this case, it was in San Martin in northern Peru, and there were many different organizations across that region. Like even Disney was even channeling money into certain parts of the region to offset the expansion of its cruise line. So we were really asking questions around, okay, well, what does this money actually do on the ground? Is it benefiting nature conservation and also people, or are there all sorts of unintended outcomes? What we found were actually kind of also a lot of ways in which these projects were failing, but because we realized kind of the limitations of that very simplistic model of simply doing the research, and there were certain collaborative parts of it, but we really towards the end of that PhD project, also with two long-term Peruvian friends and collaborators on this project, Margarita and Raidit. We ended up actually designing more dialogues and exploring how do you design a space that allows people to talk about the ways that these projects are failing. And yeah, I would say when we kind of went for the multi-stakeholder model and bring everyone in the room, that was much more difficult, and that made me realize actually just how hard it is to design these spaces and dialogues. So then we ended up actually getting more funding to try a different sort of approach that was trying to facilitate learning within individual organizations that were experiencing certain challenges also with their work. And that ended up being a much more fruitful space to open up dialogue. And that's how I think also this was around the time when I had the opportunity to start this work on the co-production project. So it was really interesting then to better understand my struggles, also related to the approach I had taken to co-production, but also the many other approaches that I could take. And two approaches that I especially found inspiring among those different modes. So one is actually work that's done at the Stockholm Resilience Center. So very close colleague to Albert Norström, who you just heard from. And so this work, they took a very unique approach to co-production, because oftentimes co-production processes that we saw were engaging very much at kind of local levels. And that can really struggle to engage with or confront power relations that are so much higher than that level. And so in this case, Henrik Osterblom is one of the main scientists who was involved in this work. And he worked with some of the largest CEOs of different seafood companies around the world. And they created a safe space for fundamental reflection on values and actually what wasn't working so well within that space, which is very different than, I'd say, working with a group of powerful actors in a way where you're simply trying to answer their questions or already frame it as a win-win. But they explored how do you more genuinely open up space for fundamental reflection on values related to ocean governance. And there were all sorts of interesting design features, like also people going barefoot during parts of it as well, just to kind of get them out of their comfort zones. They're not just in your typical kind of business mode. I was also really inspired by the cases that fell under mode 5, navigating differences, because for me personally, that really opened up my eyes to the power of the arts and sciences when integrated together to co-produce changes in a very heated dispute context. So in this case, Ruth Brennan, she was working in Barra Island off the coast of Scotland. And it was a context where the state had come in and had imposed new marine protected areas based on legislation and based only on ecological values. But the communities were they erupted kind of in this heated dispute because they felt completely left out of that decision. And so they, instead of going with the initial rigid map that was brought in on paper that only expressed biological values, they co-produced with different local people an alternative map that also showed different relationships both heritage, but also people's present engagements with different parts of the sea. And just having that much more dynamic map, which also included stories, music, all sorts of diverse art forms, was a really important sort of almost boundary or artistic object that allowed the state to see the potential role of people in a nature conservation process in a very different way. And because it wasn't just this object that's created and nothing's done with it, but it was very much part of this institution building process of how do we navigate better management of our common space around. I found that to be a very interesting approach to co-production. And then the second paper and main part of work that came out of that collaboration, we came up with this concept of co-productive agility to describe how in various projects they found a way to not have to decide from the outset what the goal was, which would really result in kind of hardened possibilities in terms of what people could create together, but to create a space where diverse people were willing to navigate different ideas and actions, and then ultimately over time come to some sort of framing, so much more kind of flexible way of even understanding the problem in the first place, let alone different possible ways of approaching it. And so we also, this is kind of the screenshot of also the musical abstract of that paper, because we also thought it'd be interesting to express that kind of idea in a also not only conventional scientific paper or format, but engage with the arts. So a friend of mine and I who used to play music together, we then thought through, okay, with these different archetypes that often limit what we can do in co-production, like the hero who's so sure of what the problem is and what the solution is, or the woodpecker who really wants to kind of critique all possible solutions, or the host who kind of naively wants to create space for all perspectives but doesn't really understand how to navigate the power among them or create space for tension and difference. Or the genie who is very supportive of, say, a hero's agenda, but doesn't necessarily critique it or question it in a way that would be really productive. So we turned each of these different archetypes into a different musical line. So in my case, for the hero, it was like a singing loop of problem, solve it, and then the genie was a bass. And we kind of built up through this abstract also how it's so easy for these different archetypes to just reinforce the same way of approaching problems, and that we really need much more productive tension where we're responding in much more agile ways to, for example, elevate marginalized agendas or really question dominant agendas or navigate conflicting agendas, which we were just talking about in the Scottish case, or create open spaces for exploring diverse agendas. So this was something that we kind of really came out of all of our 32 cases of exploring this in different ways. And I think this is this quote is kind of a nice way of encapsulating that if you do not change direction, then you might end up where you are heading. It's often very difficult for us to question these ultimate goals, which we think are desirable, which as researchers is oftentimes scientific knowledge is kind of the main goal point or focus. And I think what was so striking to us across the co-production work is that the actual successful production of knowledge outputs and papers was even slightly negatively, not to a significant degree, but you can see kind of the pink color, even a little bit like it didn't have a significant link to achieving outcomes on other fronts like empowerment, or building of new networks or building of new institutions. And so it really led us to even further challenge the idea that if we just produce the scientific knowledge and achieve that's somehow going to lead automatically to these other things, that we really need to focus directly on reframing or institution building as part of these co-production processes. And so then for me, Yeah, where lies the potential of co-production to actually reorient our collective direction, so we're not just using it to better pursue our existing narrow goals, but it actually opens up our sense of what goal together is desirable in the first place. I think this is a really crucial thing for us to explore and continue to explore more deeply. And for me, what has been, I think, especially inspiring has been to shift towards imagination, like I was saying at the very beginning of the talk, because a lot of our science, you could call it, and what Kenneth Gergen calls it, a world mirroring approach, and that we often, through science, try to hold up a mirror to the world to describe in detail, or whatever part of the world we deem valuable to describe. We try to say how we see, like describe what it is, what actually exists, which is obviously extremely valuable and super important in terms of what science does. And we often neglect this other type of knowledge production, which is really the production of how do we want or desire our world to be, which is not so much a world mirroring approach. It's much more this world making approach of making alternative possible ways that the world could be, and that we really need both of these approaches present if we want to encourage things to change. Yeah, and I think I basically just described these other parts, but it allows science, so it allows as research to step into not just a past reinforcing role where we are taking our reality that we're studying, we're actually further reinforcing it and taking that to be the reality, and allows us to step more into a future forming role of research where we can actually actively participate in the creation of a more just and sustainable world. And one thing that inspires me here too is also what language are we using? I know we throw around the term stakeholder this, stakeholder that all the time. And at some point I started to wonder, like, stakeholder, that really, it's like we're sticking our stakes in the ground. It's really kind of a rigid way of even describing the people that we're trying to work with in the first place. And it has already been suggested by others that maybe we should talk about stakeholding as a verb, as opposed to stakeholder as a more fixed noun that already shows that this is something that we're doing. So maybe our stakes can change. But I think it's also valuable to talk not only about our stakes now, but what are our dreams or our hopes or our visions of how we would like things to be. Hence my push here for the term dream holding to give a little bit more of a flexible language also in how we even refer to ourselves when we're bringing different people together. And then what does it mean to co-produce imagination? So I think I just want to briefly, because we're talking now about imagination and imagining how the world could be very different. I just wanted to quickly kind of note back to, so this idea of utopia, or imagining a radically different, quote unquote, better world. This idea comes from, so Thomas More first introduced the idea or the concept utopia in 1516, because England was increasingly becoming industrialist, capitalist, and more commons were being privatized and closed off. And so to juxtapose or kind of shake up that notion of just kind of how society was heading, he wrote about the island of Utopia, which was this alternative socialist society, which had things like free education, free healthcare, also had things that we would definitely question now, like he didn't have the imagination to eliminate slavery, for example, on this island. He also had some weird features like golden toilets, and I mean, he kind of used this, not necessarily, people aren't even really sure, was he presenting this as like, this should be the desirable society, or was he more so doing it as a thought experiment to really kind of shape people's understanding And that comes to the very word utopia because so it has a Greek origin, and it's a pun where it means both good place, but also no place. So people also aren't completely sure whether he meant it fully as like, this is a desirable good place, or is this kind of this ridiculous no place that's so different than what we have now. But the idea of presenting this, imagining this alternative society is to really kind of question what we have now, the reality or the present that we take for granted. And so I work now at the Urban Future Studio at Utrecht University, and this is what we are really focused on. So given that we all have these embedded notions of what is a desirable future that we're working towards, that sometimes we make very explicit, such as through visions or scenarios. Many times these visions drive a lot what we do, but we don't necessarily recognize that. So we both surface and try to make more explicit what are these underpinning ideas of what a better future is, so that we can also question them and become much more critical about these visions. But then we also use creative approaches to try to open up different people's ideas around what sorts of futures might even be possible in the first place, or what's desirable. So we have kind of both this critical and creative approach that we bring together, which I would very much call a co-production process that we're trying to oftentimes design, but very much oriented towards our imagination. And just to give one kind of concrete example, also related to a project that I'm working on now, of why I think it's so important that we find better ways to co-produce imagination. I work on a project called African Urban Futures, which is a collaboration between the Urban Future Studio and the African Center for Cities in Cape Town. And together, because we had noticed, and many others had also been noticing, that so many really large infrastructure projects that are being introduced are compounding inequalities, and especially in an African context, a lot of ideas, are almost like Western ideas, are being imported in with a lot of backing of investment and somehow framed as being sustainable or desirable, without enough questioning of how these different infrastructure models might really be exclusive and just benefiting primarily the elite. And just one, like, kind of an epitome, this isn't in an African context, but just one that's very familiar. The line in Saudi Arabia, I think, is kind of the epitome of this kind of example of this massive infrastructure that is somehow framed as green and sustainable, even though it's in the middle of a desert. And it's very clear, like, how would the world's worst off be benefiting from this, given it's such kind of an elite, fancy sort of structure. And so to respond to this, at least in the context of Africa, we've been gathering alternatives, so different examples. At the moment, we're up to 53 different initiatives where different groups across different parts of Africa have developed their own infrastructure solutions that are more just and sustainable, and really kind of tailored and emerging from the local context. And so we've together have tried to kind of create this database, kind of like the SEEDS database approach, which you see also in other settings, to show and give light to kind of the diversity of ways that people are thinking about infrastructure in a much more bottom-up, sustainable, and just way. And then also as part of that project, we are working with different groups who are using creative techniques for collective visioning. So this is just one of the groups, Chikoko Collective in Port Harcourt, Nigeria. So they are well, they do many, many things, but they're music, they have a radio station, they're music producers. They also do a lot of activism and mapping, and they're experimenting right now together also with us, so on audible futures, how do, so kind of capturing both from a sonic and audible perspective, also like evidence of massive pollution, which has taken place in Port Harcourt as a result of oil extraction, but also their restoration efforts and mangrove restoration specifically in this case. How can that kind of hearing the area in a different way engage citizens in also reimagining how they would want to see the future of their space, and also connected to different funding opportunities that are coming in to specifically change infrastructure there. So that's kind of one of the many examples of this sort of co-production project, especially oriented towards futures and imagination. And then just maybe yeah, because I also recognize, well, my PhD work was in Peru. Lately, I have not been working so much in South America, but I also wanted to point to an example, which maybe some of you are already aware of, which also I think shows the power of imagination, which was this campaign. So in Chile, this referendum vote that happened with Augusto Pinochet's dictatorship, of whether to vote yes to keep the dictatorship or no, and how originally the campaign was really kind of showing the injustices of the regime, but then they ended up kind of launching this almost like it had like music and fictional elements of showing like this is the alternative future vision or future Chile that you could have if you vote no. And also using a lot of humor and playfulness in the messaging, which was ultimately a successful campaign. And so I think that shows is one interesting example, especially from a South American context, of how how engaging actually in envisioning a positive future can be disruptive in a political context. And then I wanted to share, I'd be curious to know how many people have potentially come across Ruth Levitas's work on utopia as method, but I just wanted to flag up because I find her work the most inspiring when we're thinking about how do we imagine together alternative futures. I think utopia has been such a loaded, problematic concept historically, because it's often been used to exclude and to push the agenda of elite imaginations, as opposed to democratize and really co-produce imaginations of what is possible together. And she conceptually really elaborates, well, how can you turn in utopias into actually the beginning of a process that sparks our imagination, rather than a statement of closure, because you're really shutting down what should be imagined. And so she says we should not think of utopia or imagining futures as some sort of blueprint or plan that we're trying to fix, but it's much more productive to think of it as this method of questioning and exploring alternative futures. And to do that, she proposes 3 different modes, which she sees as fundamental to having that really reflexive, collaborative process of imagining. And essentially, between these 3 different modes or terms that you see here, what she means by these is this architectural, like, how are we actually imagining the alternative? What are we building in our mind in terms of how we see how things could potentially be different? By the archaeological mode, she means how can we be super critical about everything we're imagining? Because oftentimes when we dream up some idea, we tend to fixate on that and actually kind of shut down questioning of it. But no, how can we actually imagine alternatives, but then together really subject what we think is desirable to critique and open up questioning? And the 3rd mode that she points out here, the ontological mode, is really around, if you can imagine, we can completely stay in our heads or in theory, dreaming up an idea, critiquing it. The ontological is asking, what would it actually mean to be human and flourish and live in this world? And that sort of embodied experience of actually kind of trying it out, or really deeply imagining what it would be like from different standpoints, not just from our own perspective, gives you a much richer, also ethical understanding of what might be the implication of the world being different in that way, and potentially a much more deep way of engaging with critiquing it. So I find these, from a conceptual standpoint, these modes really inspiring. And I think, like, when we're talking about utopia, we really need to kind of better apply these modes, both to kind of the utopian visions that we see promoted all over the place. I just put a few, like Forlandia is a case from history, which is one of the most like ridiculous utopian projects that was implemented in complete failure by Henry Ford in Brazil. I don't have time to tell the whole story, but I would say look it up. Of course, we already mentioned the line, but also many other propositions that we see now. People talk about them all over the place, like geoengineering, also the energy transition, circular economy, also degrowth. These all have very particular ideas behind them of what a better world is like. And we really need to also question what people mean by this, and not try to kind of only shut down, but also build more collective notions that are more open to interrogation. And I wouldn't only limit this to kind of what exists in reality, but also really inspiring to see what's out there in fiction, which can give us so many different ideas that push the boundaries of our imagination. And I just put 2 books up there by Ursula Le Guin, because I find her writing incredibly inspiring, and one of the best writers, at least I've come across, in terms of really showing or fleshing out a utopia that's not trying to make things overly simplistic or harmonious or pin down what a utopia is, but uses the form of literature and writing to activate your own imagination and get you to be critical also of the better ideas or the views of a better world that are being presented. And then finally, just briefly to wrap up, I thought I'd just also show a few examples. But before I show the examples, I kind of wanted to spotlight some of the major tensions that I experience in doing this kind of work. And I'll just briefly explain what I mean by both of these. But I experience a tension in the logic that underpins these efforts to co-produce imagination, but also a tension in what kind of relationships are we constructing. And so on the imaginative logic, I find that when people often imagine futures, there's often a desire to try to close it down, or say, for example, I have a view of what a sustainable farming system should look like. Therefore, I'm going to get that out in the world and try to convince or compel others of my vision of what a better future looks like. This is in the context of the Netherlands, because that's where I'm based. But so many people have come up with different visions for example, what renewable energy might look like in the North Sea, or what a more green Netherlands could look like if we map it out. And I would say, on the one hand, you can really like provoke or offer something new, but the danger of presenting it as a very like, we should absolutely do this, so really like a proposal or a closed proposition, is that it was never really co-produced, that idea of a better world, and it really risks shutting down the conversation or alienating a lot of people who don't buy into that vision already. And so there are others who are experimenting with a more open approach to imagination, either by creating space for people to imagine a desirable future, or by provoking with such a ridiculous idea that it's not, the purpose of putting it out there is not to say, yes, let's do this, but it's to be so ridiculous that you spark people's imagination and you activate them in a new way. And so this is just one example of that on the left. This is a poster that shows in San Francisco, the football stadium being turned into a community garden. And it's something that they didn't make as like a political proposition to try to make this happen, but more so as a commentary on how do we use our public space, and to kind of flip a bit what is absurd or what is desirable, to get people to really think about this. And yeah, as I just said, I think the danger of that open approach is, for example, if you try to facilitate imagination in a room, if there's no sort of frame or guidance, it can really reinforce people's dominant views because they might come up with what they see as desirable, which very much mirrors what they already see as desirable in the present. So it's very difficult. We kind of need something that disrupts people's assumptions. And we also, I think, there's also the problem that if you go with something really ridiculous like gardens turned into a football stadium, we often get politicians who dismiss alternative visions because they say, oh, that's not feasible. And we need to find, I think, ways of imagining more radically, but ways that don't just further whatever political views are dominant now, just because they can so easily dismiss this as something ridiculous. So that's one tension that I find a lot, and I think it's so important then to figure out when we're co-producing imagination, how can we provoke with like specific ideas and frames, but also really foster this openness for people to imagine. And the other part of that is really then like what relationships are we creating through the act of imagining, because so often people focus on what is the vision, what is the alternative, what is the map, and that's really about the content, but they're not so focused on how are we reshaping people's feelings and relationships through the act of imagining together. And I think that's so important because otherwise we can fall into this trap of just further polarizing frictions, or the less apparent trap of just suppressing tensions because people are so much in an echo chamber or have so much solidarity with each other that it's uncomfortable to maybe be the different voice. So we need to find a way, I think, of bridging between frictions and solidarity. Which I think really does connect to this concept of co-productive agility that I explained before, but it orients it also towards our hopes and our dreams. So puts it also in kind of that future desire space. And then to close, I'll just quickly say a few examples very quickly. So this is from the context of the Netherlands. In the context of heated disputes between farmers who have been asked many, many times to change their approach subject to different financial but also environmental legislations, and the government. And an artist, Lucas de Man, he created this model peatland landscape that you see in the upper left with fictional stories of different farms and different characters. And they used that sort of fictional setting then to almost show a model of some of the key challenges that different people are facing in that landscape. And then so on the table on the right, you can see there are different materials. There are also different roles that people could step into to then in that fictional setting, explore from different perspectives, challenges, and how might they actually approach decision-making or solving these problems. And having kind of that fiction, so getting people out of like, oh, that's my land, and this is how I want to exactly treat it. That opened up space for more imagination and more reflection and also more empathy of different perspectives that then can be bridged or linked back to actual, real, existing problems. I feel like I don't have to, I feel like a lot of you will be probably already very familiar with so Paulo Freire and Augusto Boll and Theater of the Oppressed, but I also find this really inspiring model for the role of theater to give people space to explore in a very democratic way different systems of oppression that are occurring, and to really engage with those and give people space to experiment creatively with alternatives. And so I find I'm especially interested in artistic approaches to engaging with these conflicts and challenges, but also imagining possible ways forward. And I find Theater of the Oppressed and the many forms of it very inspiring in that respect. And then finally, last example, which I find prefiguration so important because it's so easy to imagine what knowledge, like what solution might be important or what future might be better. But we can't, like, it's so hard to get far in that regard if we don't actually prefigure it and try it out now. And just one small example of that is the Living Streets, or in the past, Reclaim the Streets movement, where, so in the Living Streets movement, and just one example here in Ghent, Belgium, they reimagined their streets, but then they actually decided to try it out for a period of weeks and turn streets into public space. And in some of these cases, then once it's actually a thing that people have experienced and become attached to, they then make longer term, more permanent decisions to make that change, which no one would ever probably make upfront when you've never experienced it. So I think we also need collective ways to try out these experiments and actually feel what it feels like before the pressure of making some sort of long political decision. Yeah, so that's everything. I'll just leave you with a quote: "We must live in this world as citizens of another," by Ruth Levitas, who I already mentioned, because I find her work so inspiring. Yeah, I'm very curious to hear any questions that people have related to this or any of the papers or anything else.
Thank you very much, Josie, for the exciting lecture. Thank you very much. Silvana has a question. Go ahead.
Thank you, and thank you so much, Josie. It's also great to see you present here with very interesting, motivating ideas as well. And I also appreciate this as coming from an arts and design background. So I'm actually curious about this aspect. Talking about, you spoke about multiple things that to me connect to the question of, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on if we acknowledge that there's a need to carefully design these spaces and consider the different methods or approaches in co-production, and also moving from the mirroring approach to the world-making approach. Also, you mentioned the adoption of creative methods and artistic methods. So I wonder, what is your take on the current participation and engagement of artists and designers in this space, and whether there is, you notice any tensions going back to this aspect of power dynamics in the co-production and different disciplines? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much, Silvana. Yeah, there are so many different power imbalances. I mean, I think even if you look to the history of why utopia and why radical imagination has been so problematic, it's oftentimes because, for example, artists or designers have been totally instrumentalized, hired to represent those visions, and have actually no power or no role explicitly to influence that imagination in the first place. And I still see that all the time. Honestly, I still think that's the mainstream, and even why when people say science, art, collaborations, like there's a reason why science comes first in that equation and why it's somehow this separate binary. I've seen so many examples where, say, like I don't want to pinpoint natural scientists, but sometimes like certain science disciplines will hire artists also because the scientists are bringing the money to then hire artists to implement some sort of vision or communicate science better, which I think really underestimates and undermines the value of that creative process of design and artistic practice to actually reshape and challenge those initial ideas, or come to facilitate completely different sorts of ideas. And at the same time, the problem, because you really need them, then there's also the problems. You could say, oh, well, because scientists bring the money, that gives them the power. But then when scientists don't bring the money, that still gives them the power, because then artists are not fairly compensated for their work. So that's also a problem. So you need to bring the money, but in a way that doesn't allow the scientists to set the agenda. And I think that's a huge struggle, which we need to better figure out how to arrange space for these collaborations in the first place.
Thank you so much.
Josie, We have a Karen question. I don't know if Karen want to ask directly to Josie or prefer that I read from the chat. Okay.
Thanks.
Yeah.
It's fine to read from the chat.
Oh, okay. Karen put on the chat, I really like your work. I believe that the citizen science is a co-production model. What do you think about it? Or about citizen science in particular?
Thanks, Karen. Yeah, I find the idea to connect research processes and citizenship processes I find really interesting. I wonder if also this kind of relates a little bit to to Silvana's question, that what I'm most interested by is what is the power dynamic then between scientists and citizens? Because I do worry a bit if scientists come in and they say, like, this is the valuable knowledge to be collected, citizens help me collect this, that still keeps the power entirely with the scientists of what knowledge is valuable or useful in this case. So I think I would be most interested in what are models that allow citizens to have a greater role in even determining in the first place what knowledge of what is valuable and what is a legitimate or powerful way of collecting that in the first place. So what method even makes sense? Because sometimes it can always be like through an app or that's kind of already decided and then people are invited in. So I think that it's interesting to shift the power dynamics a little bit, maybe even within citizen science. Yeah, but also to recognize that not everything can be totally co-produced and collaborative. So it's not to say that it's bad if the scientist comes to some sort of question, but then what underpins that question? Why is science motivated to ask that question in the first place? Who funded that? Where did these ideas come from? I think we have to be critical about interrogating why is that a valuable question? Whose power does that question serve?
Josie, I have a question. I like very much your paper about the CIS mode of co-production, and I have a question about this. In the study cases that you have the chance to read or analyze, it's quite common to find a combination of these modes. I'm talking about that is a combination from mode 1 and 2 or other combinations.
Yeah, that's a really good question, because you always find with this sort of clustering process that you're just like almost cutting the cake in a certain way that's compelling, but then you're always kind of shutting out certain types of differences. And I think, yeah, there are definitely cases that were more squarely rooted within those modes that probably shaped more the fact that that became a mode in the first place. And then other cases that were more maybe at the boundaries of different modes that were kind of probably like shoehorned a bit towards being most similar to certain types of approaches. And I guess the challenge there as well is that then with that kind of analysis, you're also looking for what are the most dominant practices that we see in co-production at the moment. So it's almost like a typology of the now, which then, which is very much a world mirroring approach. So it's interesting to then also ask, like, what are the ways of imagining co-production processes or modes of co-producing that are so unusual compared to what we see now, or also maybe are on the margins and would be great to further experiment with and strengthen. And we did see, it's funny, I have now recently in PhD sessions with kind of 20 PhD candidates in my faculty of geosciences. I have them kind of map out like what mode they're what they're following, and it's always like majority either in mode 1 researching solutions or mode 4 that I was in kind of reframing power, producing the kind of the critical knowledge, which are both really overemphasize the role of knowledge in change. And then you have kind of like one or two that are in a different mode. So I think also part of the value of having these typologies is to make us realize as well that we are very much taking one particular approach compared to what we possibly could do. And the danger of presenting us like 6 modes or typology is that we trap or we limit our imagination of that is what's possible in co-production. So I think it's a really useful thing to keep questioning.
Thank you, Josie. I have an additional question that emerged from Adriana Saldaña comment that I can translate. One of the main problems right now is the imagination crisis. And in this sense, how can overcome this problem from the perspective of the university, from the studies at graduate and postgraduate programs? Because part of the story of the imagination crisis is related to our educational scheme. What do you think?
Yeah, it's an excellent question. Such an important question. Yeah, it's funny because I went to 2 talks this past week that both come at this question from a different direction. So Amitav Ghosh was visiting Utrecht and he writes about the imagination crisis. And then Jenny Stevens writes about, so she's just about to release a book on transforming our university. Which I think these are 2 people who are really like thinking about these issues from both of those angles right now. And I mean, what Jenny Stevens shared, so this is just yesterday actually, there are so many ways in which our universities are set up to limit our imagination and just reproduce, for example, knowledge that was relevant, 10 years ago or in the past, and like keeping us stuck in this linear transfer model where then still teachers keep most of the power to then bring this knowledge from the past through, and really undermining also the potential for learning to be a much more democratic space and also a welcoming space for more diverse perspectives. Amitav Ghosh, in his talk, he critiqued the fact that higher education has often been very alienating. So like with these right-wing movements that we're seeing emerge and populist movements everywhere who see higher education as actually like an alienating space or a space where there is no belonging. And what is it about how higher education has gone in certain ways that has really totally become disconnected from that? And are there ways of fostering more reconnection, but also without like making the losing the integrity of the university as a critical space? And so I think for me, it's really like, how do we foster spaces within the university that are very supportive of critical thinking, so we don't lose that critical side, but also how do we foster solidarity and empathy and have it be a space for hope and connection as well? Because I also don't see, sometimes I'm shocked the number of syllabuses or course guides where the main goal is to transmit very particular knowledge and doesn't say anything about what kinds of citizens, or are we cultivating hope in the classroom, or critical capacities. So I think that's really important to prioritize in our education systems.
Thank you very much, Josie. Idia, go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Hi, everybody, and thank you very much, Josie. It was very inspiring, your presentation, and I liked it very much about what you suggested, going beyond binaries, going this kind of logic of dichotomies, seeing it as opposite and not complementary. And it's very interesting also what you say about this distinction between the what and how we feel. But going beyond the binaries, it's interesting to connect the what with the feelings, because the future is directly related about our emotions. And going deeper, going underneath the what, we find the emotions which are provoking sometimes the what we are imagining. What do you think about?
Yeah, I completely agree with you, Lydia. I think also sometimes why conversations remain so difficult in terms of getting anywhere is because they remain so much in the abstract. People kind of think that they agree about what a better world is like, but they're not actually getting to the concrete proposals or propositions of what that might actually mean or feel like, as you're saying, also from very different perspectives. But for some reason, I feel like in conversations, when people become really specific sometimes in describing what that better world might be like, they have become specific partly because they believe so strongly that is the solution, or they've somehow become rigid with that specificity. And so I wonder, like, what are ways that we can get that sort of specificity of really kind of fleshing out what we mean so people can disagree and talk about those different standpoints, but without narrowing down or making that proposition more rigid precisely because it's more specific. And I don't know how to do that. I mean, I'm experimenting in various ways, but I think you've hit on a really important challenge. And what you said about feeling, like oftentimes, and maybe one of my frustrations in academia and academic spaces is oftentimes it's driven by such a theory or knowledge sort of space that's seen as kind of the legitimate or valid way to be discussing what is desirable or what's the better idea, that then when we leave that feeling or emotional connection out of it, it really limits, I think, how people can talk about these differences or engage in these differences. So I also think we need to find ways of getting especially within academic spaces, but also many other spaces, getting out of that sort of logical, rational headspace of where being right or being wrong is threatening to your identity, or is what you care most about. And that's where I think also art and design is so powerful in helping us to do that.
Thank you very much. A little thing. Are you aware about Real Miller works and future literacy framework?
Yes, I have come across that futures literacy framework and a few different futures literacy. But did you want to say something about it in particular that maybe I'm not aware of actually?
Not only not only commenting because it's a good frame to connect both things.
Oh, great! Yeah, I should take
Maybe
another
we
look.
can talk later. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Josie. The last question, Sheila, go ahead.
Oh, infinite thanks, Josie, for your work. It's so inspiring and so touching in so many dimensions. So I'm really, really infinitely thankful to you. Well, I shared some comments that in the chat that might be related to all the things that you were commenting, specifically in relation to the transformation of food systems. But I don't know if you are in touch with, because all or what you were saying about future thinking and perspective or foresight, the French modelers of Syrah, INRAE, they are very concerned about that, and they developed a new method called agrément and agrément-terrain, which is a more democratic way of doing foresight and of modeling in a very open way, no, and not just with econometric black boxes, but really more related to tools that could dialogue with economy, but also to all the community. And what they were saying in France in the Centre de Sociologie de l'Innovation, the Center of Innovation in Sociology, the place where Bruno Latour used to work, is that and my question is if you're planning to also engage in the IPCC discussions, because they were telling that in a critical assessment of the IPCC that the way they are modeling, they are computing the scenarios is not aligned with the narratives. Is not aligned with the narratives of sustainability and reduction of inequalities and many other aspects. And so they said in a book by Carrie Deprick and others, they were saying that the challenge of the next cycle of the IPCC is to have more diverse visions, but in the way we are computing, no, in the way we are constructing those big scenarios. So I think that would be, I don't know, the interrelationship between these new ways of modeling and your work and future imagination. I think it's crucial, but well, I don't know. I don't have words to thank you because I don't know, just this talk, I don't know, I have like optimism for 4 more years of work. I don't know, it's really, I don't know. Thanks so much. And well.
Oh, thanks so much, Sheila. That's very kind of you. And I really appreciate your suggestion. I actually just copied it from the chat because I am not so aware of that, or I'm not aware of that work at all. So I'll follow up and look at that because I think it's really, especially given that modeling and scenarios is one of the most dominant approaches that's really taken hold in especially policy spaces or spaces that have a lot of decision-making power. And as you were saying, with a lot of these modeling approaches, they do often so much overemphasize both just taking wherever there is data, which is very much like the world mirroring, where can we find data of our assumptions of how the world works, and then projecting that forward and really limiting what kinds of possible futures or pathways we can imagine. So I think it's really important to find more radical alternative ways of modeling and engaging in that sort of futuring approach, but in a way that doesn't carry forward all this baggage of assumptions that are so designed to just reinforce the status quo. But given also how much power modeling and scenarios has, it's probably much more productive, as you say, to find ways to kind of twist or shift that than to just completely ignore or abandon it. So I'm very curious to see and track people's work who go more and more in that space. Because so far, I suppose I have kind of stayed on the side of it, wondering, okay, what is the potential of modeling? But I would love to be convinced that kind of alternative can be done in that space.
Yeah, it's just done in a different way. They work with a huge amount of data, no, FAOStat or World Resources Institute, but it's not compacted in an econometric way in the first place. In the first place, it's more like ecological economics, but then it's translated into the market and how we have access. But the data is that, but they organize the data in a different way. And well, that is also, huge. And it's applied to regions. It's a method that it's being applied to municipalities, or in this case, a huge province, which is like, I don't know, in India, a little province is like, has like more than 50 million people, no? So it's huge. It's more than the population in Argentina. So it's a tool that is starting to be applied to different contexts. So I think it could go very, very well with all the things that you were telling.
Yeah, interesting, and nice to also develop more of that direct kind of contextual link that matters now as well. Instead of like I feel like many models are at such kind of like a high abstracted level that you lose that meaningful link to, say, whatever context in which decisions are potentially being considered in relation to that whole process.
Yeah, thank you. I would challenge the name of the project. You are like urban studies, no? It implies just which I think which relationship that will have with rural landscapes, no? That would be.
Yeah, no, definitely. Yeah, both of that project and also for the Urban Future Studio, at some point they thought, can we get rid of the urban? But then, then you end up with problems of, but the acronym and So for now, we're also still sticking with Urban Future Studio, but we are trying to take a more broad approach in the way that we actually see that scope.
Josie, thank you very much. I know that as mentioned before, Albert, this period is quite complicated for your agenda in the North, and thank you very much for the effort, and it was a pleasure to meet you. And I changed to Spanish. Por favor, recuerden que el ciclo retorna 1:30 con varios casos relevantes de Uruguay a cargo de Santiago Dogliotti y Rugia. Un placer. Thank you very much.
Mucha suerte con el resto de tu programa.
Ok.
Bueno, muchas gracias.
Un gran abrazo a todos.
Gracias.
Chao.
Cuídense.
Hasta luego. Chao.
Chao.